The wind had a voice that night. It moaned low through the gaps in the weathered, clapboard walls of the little frontier town, whistling through chimneys, rattling loose shutters as though the storm meant to pry them open by force. Snow fell not in delicate flakes but in hard, driving pellets that stung the skin and buried every trail, every footprint under white silence. The winter was cruel this year, crueler than many could remember, and this storm was its fiercest hand. Behind those shuttered windows, families sat close together by dimming fires. A few lamps flickered weakly in glass panes, painting the snow with a golden haze. Mothers tucked children into quilts, their voices hushed, as though speaking too loudly might draw the storm inside. Fathers muttered about dwindling coal supplies, about the wagons delayed on the mountain pass. Fear carried a sharp taste in the air, as biting as the frost itself. The town had not been built for comfort. It was a cluster of buildings at the edge of nowhere, a way station for miners, drifters, and the hopeful desperate. The saloon leaned against the mercantile like a drunk friend. The church sat stiff-backed and proud, though even its steeple bent under the wind's battering. A handful of cabins spread around the muddy main street, now a frozen river of ice. In the stillness of snow, the town looked like it had been abandoned to the elements, a skeleton of human effort against nature's indifference. Yet there was life, hidden life, tucked behind bolted doors. The piano in the saloon sat silent, the preacher's bell unswung, but in the houses the faint glow of hearths pulsed like the last embers of defiance. Each family guarded its warmth jealously. In times like these, there was no generosity, no room for kindness that cost fuel or food. Survival demanded the tightening of circles, the shutting out of outsiders, even of neighbors if necessary. It was into this silence, this fearful watchfulness, that the faintest of cries tried to rise. The sound was so soft it was nearly swallowed by the storm, a weak whimper that the wind twisted into its own keening. It came from the alley behind the saloon, where the snow collected in drifts between stacked barrels and broken crates. There, half hidden by the shadows of the buildings, lay a child. The boy, or perhaps girl, no one had cared enough to notice, was curled in a ragged bundle of cloth that might once have been a coat. The sleeves were too short, the fabric too thin, soaked through with melting snow. The child's lips were blue, cracked from the cold, and the small fingers curled stiff against the chest in a futile attempt to trap warmth. Breath came in shallow bursts, each one a struggle. The storm did not care. It howled around the small body as if mocking its fragility. No one in town had spoken of the child that evening. Some had seen him wandering before the storm struck, lingering near the saloon doors, peering into windows as though searching for a place to belong. A few had muttered that he was the orphan left when his mother died of fever last spring. Others dismissed him as a beggar, one more mouth the town could not afford to feed. When the storm came and the townsfolk bolted their doors, no one thought to call his name. It was easier not to. So he lay there now, abandoned not by accident but by choice. The town had chosen its survival over his, chosen to pretend he did not exist. Yet existence is stubborn. Even as the snow gathered on his shoulders, even as numbness crept up his limbs, the child clung to the thin thread of life with a will stronger than anyone might have guessed. His cry was faint, but it carried something the storm could not smother entirely, a plea, a spark. The night deepened. The storm showed no mercy. Inside their cabins, the people of the town pressed closer to their fires, listening to the wind and telling themselves it was only the wind. Outside, the snow covered everything in white silence, erasing tracks, disguising sins. Only the child's fragile body resisted the blanketing, his small breaths puffing frost into the black air. The town had left him in the cold. Whether he lived or died, most would not know, and fewer still would care. But the storm had another witness. The storm punished every step he took. Snow swirled around his legs, biting through moccasins patched with scraps of hide, gnawing at his bones until even his breath seemed to freeze before leaving his lips. Still, the Apache walked. He had walked longer miles under harsher suns. He had walked through deserts that burned like fire, through mountains that cut the feet to ribbons, through nights of pursuit when soldiers rode hard on his band's trail. Walking was what his people had always done, walking and enduring. Tonight would be no different, yet he was not without weariness. His shoulders bent beneath the storm, not merely from the weight of his pack, but from the years themselves. His hair, black with streaks of silver, lashed his face in the gale. A deep scar ran across his cheekbone, pale against skin darkened by sun and wind, the mark of a skirmish long past. His eyes, sharp and steady, searched through the blur of white for some sign of shelter. He was a man accustomed to being unwelcome, and towns like this one offered no warmth to his kind, but the storm was merciless, and pride did not keep a man alive when the cold sought to claim him. Around his shoulders was draped his mother's blanket, woven from thick wool, patterned with black, red, and the brown of desert earth. It carried more than warmth. It carried memory. As he trudged forward, he thought of her fingers weaving it by firelight, the way she had hummed as she worked, her voice low as desert wind. He thought of the nights he had slept wrapped in it as a boy, when the stars were bright and his father still lived. Later, he had wrapped it around his own wife, and later still, around the small, still body of a child the fever had stolen. Every thread of that blanket was history, every knot a prayer. It was his most precious belonging, not to be bartered, not to be abandoned. The town rose before him at last, its cluster of buildings looking half buried beneath the storm. From a ridge he paused, his silhouette briefly visible in the sweep of snow. He could see lanterns flickering in the windows, faint golden light against the black night. Chimneys smoked with the smell of coal and wet wood. Civilization, shelter, but also suspicion. He had come near such places before, always near, never through. He knew what names they gave his people, knew how they clutched rifles when an Apache walked too close, how they spat words like thief and killer, though they themselves lived on land taken by force. Still, the storm pressed him. The wind was sharper here on the ridge, tugging at his blanket, trying to strip him bare. His moccasins were soaked through. He could no longer feel his toes. To stay outside was to freeze before dawn. He would not die so foolishly. Survival was an instinct as deep in him as the weaving of the blanket dot, so he descended toward the town. His figure cut through the whiteness like a shadow among shadows. When he passed the stable on the edge, the horses inside stamped nervously, catching the scent of a stranger. A window shutter cracked open, and a pale face peered out before the curtain fell shut again. Somewhere a door slammed. The word Apache hissed through the air, carried on the storm like a curse. He ignored it. He had heard it all his life. He kept his eyes on the narrow alleys between buildings, looking for a place where the wind might ease. The saloon loomed ahead, its door closed tight, lamplight seeping around its frame. Laughter did not escape with it, only silence. Even the saloon had surrendered to the storm. Behind it, he knew, there would be crates and barrels, perhaps shelter enough to outlast the night. He moved toward the alley dot, and then he stopped. It was faint, nearly lost beneath the howling of the wind. A sound no louder than a sparrow's cry, weak and raw, yet it pierced through the blizzard like a knife. His ears, trained in silence and distance, caught it again, a whimper. The sound of suffering. He turned his head, listening hard. Not the wind. Not the groan of wood. A child. For a moment he stood motionless, snow thickening on his shoulders, his breath heavy. The town had no welcome for him, he knew that well. But the cry was not from the town. It was from something abandoned, something left to die. His eyes narrowed toward the alley's shadows. The storm howled again, but he had already chosen. His feet carried him forward, silent in the snow, toward the cry that no one else had heeded. The cry came again. It was so faint, so fragile, that another man might have dismissed it as nothing more than the storm's tricks. The wind had a way of mimicking voices, pulling at a man's imagination until he heard what was not there. But the Apache had spent a lifetime listening to the land. He knew the difference between wind and breath, between the mournful groan of wood and the thin whimper of something alive. He turned into the alley. Snow drifted waist-high in places, curling around broken crates and barrels left to rot. Shadows lay heavy there, broken only by the dim glow leaking from the saloon's rear window. The storm whistled through narrow gaps between the buildings, a cruel flute that drowned all other sounds save one. That cry, weak and strangled, rose again as he pushed deeper into the dark. And then he saw it. At first it looked like nothing more than a discarded bundle of rags, half buried by the storm. He would have stepped past it, thinking it trash blown into the corner, but the rags stirred. A small hand, pale and stiff, shifted just enough to betray life. He crouched. The child lay curled tightly, arms wrapped around a chest too thin, lips cracked and blue. A smear of snow crusted the hair, which clung damp to the forehead. The rags were no coat, just scraps of old cloth, too thin to keep out the storm. The child's breath came in shallow bursts, each one shuddering, each one a battle. Frost clung to the lashes like glass needles. The Apache's jaw tightened. He did not reach out immediately. Instead, he studied the small form, his eyes sharp, taking in every detail. The weightless limbs, the shallow pulse fluttering in the neck, the way the chest rose only after long, painful pauses. He had seen children like this before on the reservation, in villages starved by winter, in families broken by fever. He knew the nearness of death when he saw it. The child was dying. For a moment, memory swept him backward. He saw another small body, limp and fever-hot, lying in his arms years ago. His own son, no older than this one, his breath rattling like dry leaves. He remembered the desperate prayers, the herbs crushed in trembling hands, the songs sung through tears. He remembered the silence that followed, the terrible stillness. And he remembered laying the boy down in the earth, wrapping him in the very blanket that now clung to his own shoulders. That wound had never healed. It never would. The storm whipped harder, stinging his eyes, pulling him back into the present. He looked down at the stranger's child, abandoned in the alley like refuse. The town had left this little one to freeze. He could see the proof in the closed shutters, in the faint lamplight glowing from behind doors where people sat warm by their fires. They had heard the cries as he had, but turned their faces away. It was not their concern. A muscle worked in his jaw. For years, towns like this had looked upon him as less than human. They had spat at his people, cursed them, hunted them. Yet here was their own child, left for dead by their fear, their indifference. He felt the old bitterness burn in his chest. Why should he care for the life of a people who had shown his none? But when he looked again at the child's face, all he saw was need. Not race, not hatred, not history. Just a child, small and helpless, clinging to life as best it could. The bitterness ebbed like smoke in the wind. He loosened the pack from his shoulders and lowered himself onto one knee in the snow. His fingers, rough and scarred, moved with unexpected gentleness as he brushed the frozen hair back from the child's forehead. The skin beneath was icy, far too cold. He did not hesitate now. He pulled the blanket from his shoulders, the sacred, precious blanket that held the weight of his past, and wrapped it carefully around the trembling body. The wool swallowed the child whole, leaving only a pale face peeking out. He gathered the bundle against his chest, tucking it beneath his chin. At once he felt the shiver of small breaths against him, faint but real. His own body heat seeped through. fighting the cold that had nearly claimed the child. For a long moment he held the child close, listening to the storm howl around them. The snow still fell, the wind still bit, but something shifted. The cry of the wind no longer stood alone. There was another cry now, softer, weaker but alive. The Apache rose to his feet, cradling the bundle in his arms. Whatever came next, whatever danger or judgment the town might throw at him, did not matter. He would not set this child back down in the snow. The storm had called, and he had answered. The Apache did not waste time. Once the child was in his arms, he shifted the small body so it rested against his chest, the way a warrior might cradle a weapon he could not afford to lose. The storm snapped at his back, trying to tear away the warmth he was giving, but he drew the blanket tighter around them both. The blanket, it was more than wool, more than cloth. It was a vessel of memory, a shield against time and cruelty, a lifeline now shared with a stranger's child. The weave was thick, heavy with years. Its dark lines told the story of mountains under a red sky, of rivers winding across sand, of prayers whispered into thread. As he wrapped it around the child, he remembered his mother's hands guiding the loom, each motion steady, each color chosen with care. She had told him once, "A blanket is not just for warmth. It is for carrying love through the cold places." That truth pressed against him now. The child's trembling eased slightly beneath its embrace, though the breath still came shallow. He could feel the ribs sharp under the fabric, could feel the frailty of a body already too close to death. Carefully, he adjusted the folds, making sure the wool sealed out the wind. His own shoulders were bare to the snow now, the storm gnawing at his skin, but he ignored it. The blanket's duty had changed hands. He crouched against the saloon wall, shielding the child with his body, studying the face half hidden in the weave. Pale skin, lashes clumped with frost, lips chapped and cracked. The eyes fluttered once, as if fighting to open, then closed again. A weak moan slipped past the child's mouth. That sound, fragile as it was, brought a sharp ache to the Apache's chest. It was the same sound his own son had made on his last night, the same small plea, a sound that begged for comfort but had no words. For a moment he was back there again, kneeling on hard earth, his son fever-hot in his arms, his wife singing a prayer that wavered with grief. He had wrapped his very blanket around the boy, whispering promises the fever refused to hear. In the end, it was silence that answered him. Silence and a hole in the earth. The memory burned, but he did not push it away. He let it flow through him, the sorrow mixing with resolve. This child would not be left to silence, not while he still had strength to carry. The storm's howl broke against the alley walls. From a window nearby, faint light spilled through cracks in the shutters. He knew the townsfolk were watching. Perhaps they had seen him stoop, had seen him gather the bundle. They would whisper among themselves now, "What is he doing? Why is the Apache touching the child?" Suspicion was as sure as the storm. But none of them had stepped outside. None had offered even a scrap of cloth. It was easier to watch, to let him take the weight of their abandonment. He did not care. Their judgment meant nothing. The child stirred against him, a faint shiver running through the small frame. He lowered his head, speaking in a low hum, a lullaby older than any building in this town. The melody was rough, unpracticed, but steady. Words in his own tongue, words of mountains, of fire, of protection. He felt the child's breathing change, still weak, but no longer erratic. The rhythm of the song seemed to give the small heart something to cling to. Snow stung his exposed shoulders. The storm leached his warmth. But he did not shift the blanket back onto himself. The child needed it more. That was what the blanket had always been for: protection, sacrifice, memory carried forward. It had held his mother's hands, his son's final breath. Now it held this child's chance at life. After a long time crouched in the alley, He rose. His knees protested, stiff from the cold, but he did not falter. He adjusted the bundle against his chest, pulling the blanket's folds tighter around it. The child's face rested against him now, breath warm against his skin. It was faint, but it was there. He turned from the alley. The townsfolk could whisper all they liked from their windows. The storm could claw at him until dawn. He would walk into it with the child wrapped in his mother's weaving, carrying a prayer that had once been meant for his own blood. The blanket had found its purpose again. The Apache stepped out of the alley, the child bundled tight in his arms. Snow clung to his hair, to his bare shoulders where the blanket no longer covered him. The storm swirled around his frame, but the burden he carried made him stand taller, straighter, as though the wind itself could not bend him while the child depended on his strength. The main street lay before him, half buried under snowdrifts. The buildings, shuttered and locked against the storm, crouched like fearful animals. The saloon was dark, save for the faint glow leaking around its doorframe. The church stood rigid at the far end, its steeple bowing beneath the weight of ice. The town was silent, except for the storm. Silent but not blind. Behind every shutter, behind every frosted pane of glass, eyes were watching. Curtains twitched. Shadows shifted in lamplight. The people saw him, and their whispers rose like smoke. Apache. The word passed from house to house, no louder than breath, yet carried with venom. He's taken the child, stole it right out from under us. God help us, what's he planning? The Apache could not hear every word, but he felt their suspicion like needles in his skin. He saw the shapes moving behind curtains, felt the weight of their stares pressing on his back. To them, he was not a rescuer. He was a threat. They did not see the small hand clutching at his chest, the shallow breath struggling beneath the blanket. They saw only the old enemy, the shadow from the hills, the danger they had been taught to fear. Yet none of them came out. Not one door opened. Not one man stepped forward to take the child from him. They whispered of theft, of curses, but none had braved the storm to lift the dying body from the snow. Their cowardice was louder than their words, though they would never admit it. The Apache stopped in the street. Snow piled against his legs, the wind tugging at his hair. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head toward the nearest window. For a heartbeat, he locked eyes with the pale face peering through the glass. A woman's face, thin and sharp, her lips pressed tight. When she saw his gaze upon her, the curtain snapped shut. He shifted his weight, turning his eyes toward the next house. Another flicker of movement, another shutter closed in haste. One by one, the eyes disappeared, retreating into lamplight and warmth, unwilling to meet the silent accusation in his stare. They had abandoned the child, yet they dared to condemn the one who had not. Inside, fear gnawed at them. They asked one another in hushed voices, "What if he keeps the child? What if he uses it as leverage? What if he means harm?" Some muttered prayers, crossing themselves. Others cursed the storm for bringing him down from the hills. None spoke aloud the truth that weighed heavier than their words, that the Apache had acted where they had not. The preacher sat at his table, staring into the fire, torn between scripture and silence. The blacksmith gripped his wife's hand tighter, pretending he had not seen the orphan wandering earlier that evening. The barkeep at the saloon poured himself a drink, muttering that it wasn't his business. Each one knew, deep down, that the child had been theirs to save. And each one clung to excuses instead. The Apache stood alone in the snow, surrounded by their watching, hidden eyes. The child stirred weakly against his chest, a faint sound escaping its lips. He looked down, adjusting the folds of the blanket, shielding the small face from the cold. Then he raised his head again, scanning the street. No one came. So he moved on, his steps steady, his silence heavier than words. The people would whisper, they would mutter, They would curse, but he would walk through their storm with the child in his arms. He owed them nothing. He owed only the small life pressed against him. From the shadows of their windows, they watched him go, each one feeling the sting of his presence like a mirror turned against them. He carried no weapon but a blanket, no threat but the truth of their failure. The storm howled, drowning out their shame, but it lingered in their hearts long after he passed from their sight, and still, not one door opened. The Apache left the accusing silence of the street behind and walked toward the edge of town. The storm still clawed at him, but his steps did not falter. He carried the child pressed close, the blanket drawn tight, his own body curved like a shield against the wind. Snow gathered on his hair, his shoulders, his bare arms, but he gave no thought to his own cold. All his strength bent toward keeping the fragile bundle alive. Beyond the last row of buildings, darkness thickened. The faint lantern glow of the town fell away, leaving only the storm's white blindness. Here, the land was open and harsh, the wind unbroken by walls. Yet the Apache knew where he had left a small camp before entering the town, just beyond the tree line, where the woods bent low and offered a meager refuge. He pushed toward it, his breath a steady rhythm in the night, the child's small breaths fluttering against his chest like the wings of a bird too weak to fly. At last, through the blur of snow, he saw it, the faint glow of embers beneath a hollow of rock and pine. He had kindled a fire there before seeking the town's edges, hoping to return to it if the storm allowed. Now that faint light became salvation. He crouched low as he approached, shielding the fire with his body so the wind would not snuff it out. The flames licked feebly at the wood, struggling against the storm. With one arm he held the child tight, while with the other he coaxed the fire back to life, adding small branches, blowing gently until sparks leapt and caught. Slowly the flame grew, its orange glow spreading warmth into the cold night. He sat then, cross-legged before the fire, settling the child across his lap. The blanket wrapped them both, but he opened it just enough so the fire's heat could reach the small face. The skin was pale, the lips cracked, but a faint flush began to return to the cheeks. The Apache's eyes softened, though his hands moved with precision. He reached into his pouch, pulled out a strip of dried bread, and soaked it in warm water from his skin until it softened. With careful fingers, he pressed the morsel to the child's lips. For a moment there was no response. Then, weakly, the mouth opened, chewing slowly, as though even the act of swallowing demanded all the strength left in the body. The Apache fed the child little by little, patient, waiting between bites, letting the warmth of the fire and food do their work. When the child had taken enough, he laid the small body against his chest again, the blanket wrapped close, the fire glowing at their feet. He rocked gently, not in rhythm to any thought, but to an instinct deep within him, the instinct of a father. His lips moved in song, low and steady, an old Apache lullaby carried on a voice rough with years and storms. The words spoke of mountains guarding valleys, of fire standing against night, of spirits that watched over children when parents could not. The child stirred. Eyes fluttered open, glazed and heavy, but open nonetheless. They were light-colored, though dulled with exhaustion. For a moment they blinked up at him, unfocused, then fixed faintly on his face. The small hand emerged from the blanket and clutched weakly at his shirt. He did not speak. He only continued the song, steady and soft, his voice the sound of survival in a world that had offered the child none. The firelight flickered across his features, carving lines of strength and sorrow into his face. The woods creaked under the weight of snow, but here, in this hollow, there was warmth, there was shelter, there was life. Hours passed. The storm raged on, but inside the circle of firelight it was a different world. The Apache did not sleep. His eyes watched the child's breathing, his hand adjusting the blanket when it slipped, his ears listening for every faint sigh. The child grew steadier, the breaths less shallow, the shivering less violent. Slowly, color returned to the small cheeks. The Apache knew the child was not safe yet. Fever or weakness could still claim it. But tonight, at least, life had been pulled back from the edge. He leaned back slightly, gazing into the fire. The flames danced in the black of his eyes. The town had abandoned this child to the storm. He had not, and in that quiet shelter, with the blanket around them both, the Apache knew he carried not only a child but a truth. Sometimes the heart of a so-called savage was the only place a town's lost soul could find warmth. Dawn came slowly, reluctant to pierce the storm. The snow had eased, but the air was still sharp, heavy with frost. A gray light spread across the town, painting everything in pale silence. Smoke curled thinly from chimneys. The storm had ended, but it had left the streets buried, the roofs hunched beneath a white weight. The town looked less like a place of the living than a graveyard of houses, each one shut up against the cold. The Apache sat before his fire at the edge of the woods, the child still wrapped in the blanket, still pressed against his chest. Through the long hours of night, he had kept vigil, feeding the flame, shifting the child when it shivered, murmuring songs until the small body grew warm again. Now the child's breathing was steadier, lips no longer blue. The Apache's own skin burned from the cold he had absorbed, but he ignored it. Survival was not about comfort. It was about sacrifice. From the town, voices began to stir. Doors creaked open, boots crunched in the snow. The people emerged cautiously, as if afraid the storm might turn back upon them. At first, they busied themselves with clearing paths, knocking ice from eaves, tending to their stock. But soon eyes turned toward the woods. Smoke from his fire betrayed his camp. Word spread swiftly. He's out there, with the child. Stole it. Sure as sin. Men gathered near the saloon, their coats pulled tight, rifles resting in their hands. Not aimed yet but ready. Women whispered from porches, clutching shawls against their shoulders, children peeking from behind skirts. The whole town buzzed with unease, with the sour taste of shame masked as suspicion. Finally, 3 men started toward the woods. The preacher among them, his black coat flapping in the wind, a Bible clutched under one arm. Beside him, the blacksmith, broad-shouldered, his hammer hanging at his belt like a weapon. And leading, the sheriff, his badge dull in the gray light, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. The Apache rose as they approached. He did not flinch, did not step back. He stood tall, the child cradled in the blanket, the firelight still glowing faint behind him. Snow clung to his hair, his chest bare to the cold, his breath steaming in the dawn. He looked every bit the figure they feared, silent, proud, unbroken. The sheriff stopped 10 paces away. His jaw tightened as his eyes settled on the child in the Apache's arms. "That's ours," he said, his voice low but edged. The Apache's gaze did not waver. He said nothing. The preacher cleared his throat. His words trembled between fear and guilt. "You must give the child back. It belongs to the town." The Apache shifted the blanket slightly, revealing the small face nestled against him. The child stirred, making a soft sound, and pressed closer to his chest. The preacher faltered. His eyes flicked down, then away, as though the sight burned. "You left it," the Apache said at last, his voice deep, measured, heavy with the weight of truth. His English was rough, each word clipped, but clear. "You left it to die." The word struck harder than any bullet. The men stiffened, the crowd behind them shifting uneasily. No one met his gaze. For all their suspicion, for all their fear of him, none could deny what had happened. The child had been abandoned. He had not. The sheriff's grip tightened on his rifle. He wanted to protest, to twist the truth into something easier to swallow. But the words stuck in his throat. He knew what he had seen, or rather, what he had chosen not to see the night before. And now the stranger had voiced it aloud. Silence stretched between them, heavy and damning. The storm had cleansed the land, but not their guilt. At last, the blacksmith stepped forward. His voice was low, shame threaded through it. "Give us the child, please. We'll care for it now." The Apache's dark eyes lingered on him, searching, weighing. Then, slowly, he shifted the bundle. The blanket stayed wrapped tight, but his arms loosened just enough to extend the child forward. The blacksmith stepped closer, hands outstretched, though his eyes did not meet the Apache's. When the child left his arms, the Apache felt a hollowness, as though part of the fire had been taken with it. But he did not resist. The child stirred again, mewling faintly as it was carried away. The crowd murmured, some with relief, some with shame. The Apache straightened, his shoulders bare, his chest rising in the cold air. He said nothing more. His silence was its own judgment, heavier than any sermon the preacher might deliver. The reckoning had come not by force of arms, but by the sight of a man they had called savage doing what they themselves had failed to do. The child was safe now, or as safe as the town would allow. Wrapped still in the Apache's blanket, the small body rested in the arms of the blacksmith's wife. She rocked gently on the saloon porch, murmuring words of comfort as though she had been there all along. The townsfolk gathered close, offering scraps of food, bits of cloth, words of reassurance that rang hollow in the cold morning air. But the blanket, the Apache's blanket, remained around the child. Its dark patterns of red and black stood out stark against the snow, a thing of another world, another people. None dared unwrap it, none dared remove it, for even in their prejudice they sensed something sacred in its weave. The Apache stood apart, a dark figure against the whiteness, the firelight at his back. He did not ask for thanks. He did not expect it. He watched as the child stirred faintly, cheeks flushed with life, eyes flickering open to the new day. The sight filled him with a quiet relief, though it showed only in the slight easing of his shoulders, the faintest lift of his chest. The sheriff glanced at him, uneasy. The preacher clutched his Bible tighter. The blacksmith avoided his gaze. None knew what to say. Gratitude caught in their throats, strangled by pride. Accusations withered, burned away by the undeniable truth. The Apache had done what they had not done. At length, the Apache turned. He adjusted the strap of his pack across his shoulder, the bare skin of his arms still raw from the cold he had endured without the blanket. His eyes swept over the town one final time. He saw their faces, fearful, ashamed, stubborn, and he carried the weight of that silence with him. Then, without a word, he stepped into the snow. The crowd parted, but no hand reached to stop him. No voice called him back. He walked through them like a shadow, his moccasins crunching softly in the frost, his breath rising in white plumes. With every step, the distance between him and the town grew, the space between what they were and what they should have been stretching wider than the snowbound street beyond the last cabin. Beyond the frozen corral, the land opened again, vast, silent, indifferent. He walked into it with steady pace, as though the storm had left no mark on him. His figure grew smaller, swallowed by the white horizon, until he was only a dark speck against the light. Then even that vanished. The child, still swaddled in the blanket, slept. Years passed. The storm became memory, softened by retelling, reshaped by the town's need to believe itself kinder than it had been. The orphan grew first a pale, fragile child, then stronger with each season. The townsfolk cared for the child as best they knew how, but when winter came, the child always asked for the blanket. Always. It stayed with them through every cold night, its patterns worn but unbroken, its warmth carrying something deeper than wool. When the child cried, the blanket soothed. When sickness struck, it comforted. When loneliness bit sharp, it became a shield against the dark. And as the child grew older, stories formed around the blanket. Not the town stories, those were hushed and twisted. Muttered half-truths about the Apache who wandered through. No, these were the child's stories. Private ones. A memory of a man's chest, broad and warm. Of a heartbeat steady as a drum, of a voice humming words not understood but felt. A memory of survival wrapped in red and black thread. The townsfolk tried, at times, to convince the child to put the blanket away, to replace it with something newer, cleaner, more fitting. But the child refused. To them, it was just a relic of a stranger. To the child, it was a promise, a truth stitched into every fiber, that kindness had come not from the town, but from the man they had feared most, and so the blanket endured. Long after the Apache's footsteps had been erased by wind and snow, long after the people who whispered against him had been buried in the churchyard, the blanket remained. Its weave grew frayed, its colors faded, but its story held. A child once left in the cold had lived, because a man who owed nothing had given everything. And though the town never spoke his name, the warmth of the Apache's blanket carried it forward silent, enduring, unforgotten.